Welcome everyone to MailFuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about A Murder at the End of the World, Episode 5. It's called Chapter 5, Crypt. So spoilers for the episode as always. This was a long episode. This was like 75 minutes. It's not even a premiere, a finale, and they're just whipping out 75-minute episodes on us. They can't keep getting away with it. They've only got 2 left though, so... There's not much I can do about it. What am I going to do? Get mad and outraged? No, I don't really care. It's not that big a deal. It was a bit daunting though, seeing the runtime. I'm like, oh, okay, I better settle in. This is going to be a long one. And this one obviously added a lot to the mystery of who the killer is and maybe what the motives are. It cast a massive shadow over Lee's character and what she's actually up to. Obviously, we ended the last episode with the cliffhanger of the kid. Was his name Zoomer? Yeah, Zoomer. That's the thing. Is it because he's not even he's not even Gen Z though, is he? He's like the generation after that. He's too young to be Gen Z at this point. But anyway, honestly, the mystery aspect of the show is a little convoluted at this point. And I will say, I'm not sure how much I felt like I was that invested in finding out who the killer is as this episode went on. What I was more into in this episode was the continuation of the main themes that we've been talking about, and some of the ways that it kind of brought those themes up again in this episode I thought was particularly interesting and even poignant in a couple of cases. They get a bit more direct with it. There's a whole scene where in the flashback, Bill starts talking about his phone and about how we're all addicted to phones and how he wishes he could throw it in the ocean sometimes, and compares it to previous trends about how people were all smoking back in the 40s, but at least that wasn't changing who they were. I mean, I'm going to jump in here and say I will still take everyone looking down at their phones over smoking because it doesn't smell. So so still a pretty big difference for me, not to mention all the secondhand smoke and cancer and all that part. But still, the stench is really what bothers me. But when he does that little speech, when he stops the car and he goes and sits out and looks at the horizon and he's being all dramatic and he's talking about it, what prompted that little speech was they were in the car and they were talking about when they fell for each other. Bill specifically brings up, oh, when did you knew you'd fallen for me? What was that moment? And Darby standoffish, doesn't want to answer it. And he's like, okay, fine, I'll go first. I'll offer up the information first. And he talks about the first time they met. I think that was stage 2. The first time he felt something was when she said she dead people talked to her, because he understood what she meant by that. And those were the 2 key moments. And there's a third that he's not had yet, but he's assuming there's going to be a third. And he's talking about this, and then he's like, okay, over to you, Darby. When did you know you fell for me? And she says, well, who says I have fallen for you? And then she immediately starts looking at her phone and she starts talking about the case and tracking down the ring and who owned the ring, and starts talking about putting it on Reddit. And the way he goes, yeah, put it on Reddit, like really tells you that he's a bit miffed that she's sort of using this as a shield in the moment. After he makes his little speech about phones, after he stopped the car, what he's saying, these things are changing us. We're all addicted to these little computers that we're carrying around. Darby jumps in with, the first time I knew I'd fallen in love with you was on the phone. So right there, neatly, it brings in this idea of there's all these negatives to technology and trusting technology and relying on technology. But as I've been pointing out through all the episodes, is that it's also offered so much in terms of these characters and what they're doing, in terms of the murder plot, in terms of the hotel and all that stuff, and the life-saving things that it's doing. So she effectively counters them very, very, I think it's a really good moment here, because she counters them with, no, you're sitting complaining about technology and what it's doing to us, but to give you and obviously it's kind of, there's a lot of weight to why she says this at this moment. Obviously, she's countering what he was just saying, and he's feeling so kind of lost in this sea of technology and complaining about that. So it's a counter to that, but she's also recognizing that what spurred this moment on is that he's feeling like she's buried herself in the technology rather than making the human connection that he was trying to engage in. He was trying to share something intimate with her, and she retreated from that and shielded behind the technology. But now she's presenting the fact that no, this technology is what led me to you. It's what led me to feel something for you. And I'm sure if we went back to, I think it was episode 2 or 3 when they were getting to know each other and they were Skyping all the time, there's probably some specific moments when she was looking at her phone where maybe we could pinpoint and say that's where she started to really feel something. Maybe it was when she was cooking and she was still talking to him and her dad was in the other room or something like that. It's one of those moments. And I think that's a very interesting thing to bring up here is, again, this reliance on technology. We see it throughout the whole episode. We see it. The security system does like a digital 3D scan of the base and the hotel and recreates it. We see that being used and manipulated throughout the episode. Andy's shown that to Darby. And I think one of the more interesting little moments later on is that they're trying to conserve energy, so they've got all the heating turned off, which seems like a bold move given their location. But later in the episode, some of the characters, the other guests, particularly Joan Shen's character Lumi and Ziba, have started a fire outside. And I thought this was a wonderful little visual thing because how, symbolically, what is the opposite of technology, right? You've got all this fancy central heating and like temperature control and smart house technology and all this stuff. What's the opposite of that? The opposite of that is putting some logs in a pile and starting a fire. This is caveman stuff. This is the polar opposite, right? No pun intended. So I thought that was a really interesting idea, is that they're out there talking about how they're having to rely on this primitive thing. They're using fire because it's reliable. It's a thing they can do. But earlier in the episode, we saw a wildfire, and we saw Darby and Bill in the flashback comment on how, we have to move somewhere else, and soon there'll be nowhere else to go to. But it's this idea we might be reverted back to caveman times, whilst the super rich are trying to build these high-tech bunkers to make sure technology will protect them from everything. But maybe it's the simple traditional ways that are going to protect us. So it's doing this very interesting kind of like two-sided approach of looking at the benefits but also the dangers of relying on technology. And I thought them having to huddle around a fire that they have made, and then the fact that the hotel manager even comes out and tries to tell them, hey, we can't have a fire on hotel grounds, it's dangerous, only for Ziba to give him the finger and tell him to piss off. I think, again, it's kind of symbolic. And it's like this rejection of, no, we can do it this way. This is the simple way. Sometimes ignore the high-tech thing, and the simple way is actually what's going to be more effective. It's going to be more immediate. It's going to be more fulfilling. Whatever, right? So I think all these like things peppered throughout the episode with technology. And not to mention, actually, to go back to that scene in the flashback with Bill talking about the phones and being addicted to them, and Darby saying, hey, the first time I fell in love with you was on a phone. That flashback starts right after Darby's attacked by someone who's concealing their identity, the masked person, presumably the killer, pins her down and holds a phone up to her head, and it speaks in like a Microsoft Sam style voice, a computer voice, saying, hey, stop this, I don't want to have to kill anyone else, right? I can't remember the exact wording, but that was the gist of the message. So here you have this threatening moment happening through a phone, and it's allowing a killer to conceal their identity, assuming it is the actual killer and not someone just trying to like scare her off for other reasons, which at this point feels like anything's possible with the mystery. I think the big thing with the mystery for me in this episode is, quite quickly we have Darby going down. She kind of forces or coerces technically she's the nanny, but she turns out to be more of a doctor. She knows her way around the medical equipment and all that. They go down to where Andy and his family live, and it's this deep underground bunker. It's very prestigious and pretty and glamorous and feels like something the Romans would have built once upon a time. Darby accuses Andy of being the killer, and he wanted to kill Bill because he found out that his son was actually Bill's. And what was funny is that when we had that ending last episode, I was like, well, the most obvious answer here is that Lee lied about our interaction with Bill. However, I did say that there's always a chance that it's not quite that. Maybe it's more like he donated sperm or something, and that's why the genetic condition get passed down. What I didn't predict, and I thought this was quite neat actually, is that Andy knows that it's Bill's son, but Lee doesn't. Andy's sterile. Lee doesn't know that, and it's so the implication here, he doesn't go into it in too much detail, but the implication being that he has used Bill as a donor because he himself couldn't impregnate his wife. And he does see Zoomer as his son. He loves him like a son. He wants to raise him, all that stuff. Like, it seems genuine enough on that front. And this conversation leads to him wanting Darby to work with him because he can have access to a lot of things. So he starts showing her the security stuff, and they question some of the guests together, which, you know, leads to some bits and pieces. Was it David's the guy who's kind of suspicious, who isn't quite got, you know, he was missing at the time of the murder, because this digital scan thing, the only time that it's blind is in a few minutes around midnight, 11:59, I think they said, because it's doing like a backup thing at that moment. So whoever did the killings, or at least Bill anyway, knew about that. This is someone who's familiar with the security system and the way the computer is recording stuff. So that feels like an important detail. They're talking to Oliver, who's the technology guy who's in the wheelchair, who seemed to have a sexual encounter with David. But, you know, some interesting details here that his shoes are actually a little bit worn down. So Darby asks about it, and he admits that, yeah, I can walk a little bit, but not very far, not for very long. But his shoes are worn, which maybe suggests that someone else has maybe used his shoes, or he can walk more than he's letting on. Well, just food for thought, I guess. David's very defensive. There's an interesting interaction with the head of security where he talks to Darby and gives Darby her ring back so she can get in and out of her room, and talks about understanding revenge. Tells this story about going after these kids that effectively killed his brother, even though it was like ruled an accident. So he makes it clear that he's loyal to the family, but kind of almost like gives a, I don't know, like he's almost condoning like her path of like investigation. Like he's saying he understands like her going after what she's going after and approves of it in some way, even if officially he may have to stop her at some point. He seems to understand and respect it. So okay, that's the thing. The big thing though is the Lee stuff. Darby wants to talk to Lee because it sounds like she also has a few minutes that are unaccounted for, because her and some of the guests were playing poker around the time of Bill's death, but she did leave the room for a few minutes, and she wants to ask Lee about that. Andy is very defensive when it comes to her and doesn't want to talk to Lee because he just assumes, oh, if she saw anything suspicious, she would have told me. But when he goes off to deal with a phone call, in fact, he has an outrage moment because the concierge guy tells him that the New York Times or whoever know that they're just trapped here and know that there's been a couple of deaths. And this had to have leaked from someone, so he yells out that he can't trust anyone. It says, you know, he's pretty intense. Darby's sitting there kind of uncomfortable, and, you know, it's an awkward moment. But yeah, the Lee interaction's very strange because Darby brings up the whole thing about Zoomer and Bill being the birth father, which surprisingly Lee doesn't seem to know about. This seems to be more of a surprise to her than it was to Andy. So she's dealing with that bombshell, and she goes to the bathroom. Darby looks through her bag and finds a black wig, finds a passport and like credit cards and stuff in a different name, and the photograph in the passport is also her with this black wig on, and that raises a lot of questions. And the tone of the scene, when Lee comes out and catches her looking at all this stuff, it does feel like Darby's in danger. Now, whether or not she actually is another question, but the tone of the scene definitely implies that Darby feels she's in danger because she's been caught looking at this. And it really puts a lot of suspicion on Lee that she is the big bad, possibly, or at the very least there's going to be another pivot. I will say this moment did feel like a bit of a wild swing to me, just because it kind of came very quickly out of nowhere. And I think the bigger thing for me is that it feels like the rest of the episode doesn't really do much with it. You know, Darby does say to Andy later on, like, she has a bag with a passport and another identity. Like, do you know about that? And Andy gets all defensive again. But other than that, I don't think it ever really is something the episode focuses on, or really, if anything, it feels like Darby should be obsessed with looking into her now, because clearly there's some seriously suspicious shit going on with Lee, But it never feels like the episode hones in on that. Instead, it kind of goes down the path of her dealing with the temperature, dealing with obviously someone coming into her room and attacking her, and threatening her to. And I liked how that scene was filmed, for the record. Like the cook guys at the door offering her some food, and then the whoever the masked person is like appears behind her after she's talked to him. I thought it was really well handled, the way the bad guy came in the background. I'm using bad guy as a generic term. Obviously, it may not be a guy, but like the visual of it, I thought was cool. This episode also kind of like really delves into Darby's substance abuse. We've seen her take things and whatever throughout the show up until this point, but this episode really started to feel a bit more extreme, where she's like crushing pills and snorting them. In the flashback, Bill's clearly starting to feel concerned that she's constantly taking uppers and downers and is never sleeping. She becomes obsessed, and the flashbacks kind of build up to roughly where we were in episode 1 in the flashbacks. It's kind of built, it's showing you kind of where she finds out where the killer lives, so it seems to be linking close to that. But it doesn't feel like they're in this great happy place right at that moment. In fact, Darby almost starts the fire when she's smoking, and they have to put out the fire. And I think obviously symbolically it feels like she gets so into the investigation, she becomes so laser focused that there is maybe a path of destruction in her wake almost. And that's something that Andy even kind of accuses her of earlier in the episode. He says, wherever you go, death seems to follow, which is what he says after Sean dies. Sean, of course, had the whole helmet thing last episode. She had to have her neck pierced to breathe, and she's recuperating this episode until she doesn't. She dies, and Darby talks to her. Sean basically tells her not to stop. Don't stop, Darby, keep looking. I don't have too much to say on that. Maybe there were some cool details there that I maybe missed, but I felt like it was a pretty typical conversation. I think it's kind of funny because I came from this episode enjoying the more atmospheric stuff and the contemplations on the themes than I did the actual murder mystery. By the time we got towards the end of the episode, like, I enjoyed the campfire scene. I enjoyed Darby not wanting to make a toast, as it were, to Bill, because it feels like that makes it real, right? Because the others, like, they light up some, like, I don't know if it's incense or something, but they're saying things about Rohan, they're saying things about Sean, and they look at Darby's, as if they're expecting Darby to say something for Bill, and she doesn't want to. This is actually one of the moments where we go to a flashback. Her like driving herself to her. Even Ray, the computer, kind of keeps noticing this and tries to talk her down. And Ray basically ends up kind of being a therapist for a minute. And Darby starts spilling her guts out to him about feeling like she doesn't want to be awake anymore. So which definitely implies suicidal thoughts. And again, I thought this was interesting, where this whole episode, we're talking about being scared or untrustworthy of technology, and here Ray, seemingly in the moment, is being a very helpful therapeutic device for Darby. She's confessing things to him, and when she even points out that that's weird or silly or whatever, Ray's like, actually, the first computer that was designed to be a therapist was actually built in the 60s at MIT, and people talked to her because she was a good listener. It was very rudimentary, but that was one of the first existences in some ways of a computer. And now he is doing this in present day. He's a lot more advanced, and he's being helpful. Again, we could still just, like, again, the theme we're dealing with here is trusting technology and relying on it. So there's always the possibility we'll go down the path where Ray is untrustworthy and this is actually a bad thing. But I hope it isn't, in a way. Like, I think this is a really interesting idea of looking at this to the point where you've developed some kind of AI that is genuinely caring and helpful. I'm not saying it does care per se. Like, I don't know if we're at that point where we think it's really truly learning. But then again, Andy did talk about how it's a new form of AI that was created by effectively mixing two other AIs to procreate Ray. So maybe he is learning. Maybe he does, on some level, care. I don't know if the show is going to get into that sort of side of things or deal with those themes directly. Maybe, but these were the moments that I was like super glued to what was happening, because the way it was handling these themes and these contemplative moments of thinking about, oh, isn't this ridiculous that I'm sitting here talking to a computer about how I feel? But it is actually helping her get things out. It's helping her process what she's thinking. It's helping her go through things. I think ultimately the message of the show is probably that we should use technology, but there's a healthy amount of it. There's a healthy amount of relying on it, and there's a healthy amount of touching grass, as the kids say, by escaping it and just being in nature. And, it's hard not to think of them sitting at the fireplace being kind of similar to her and Bill sitting just on a log in the desert and sort of looking up at the sky. And notably, when they look up at the sky, they get some of the northern lights, right? They get the aurora borealis, if I'm saying that correctly. And it's this natural, beautiful thing. It's this natural wonder, and they're all kind of oohing and ahhing at it, and that makes them give the sort of the tributes, if you will, to the people who have died. And I think that's showing again that here's this natural beauty of things, and just how wondrous the world can be without the technology. So it's very much bouncing around these kind of two sides of the same coin and trying to balance those things out. I am loving all that stuff quite a bit, and I was still loving it in this episode. But the actual investigation parts, I was a little more middling on. Like, it's not so much that they're particularly bad or anything, it's just that it feels like not much like significant concrete stuff has really felt like I've really felt like we've got something really concrete in the last couple of episodes. It's throwing more red herring things at me, and it's starting to feel like until the end of the next episode or maybe the finale, it's probably not worth getting too invested in any particular possibility. At least that's the vibe I'm feeling right now with the murder mystery stuff. But I like so much of everything else the show is doing in terms of its commentary, in terms of its almost just meditation on these key ideas that it's delving into. I mean, hell, when Andy's talking about his son, he says, yeah, Bill provided the hardware, but I provided the software, and software is the important part. Which, is such a comparing raising of a child to simple computer terms is, again, sort of tying into the theme in some ways. And I think the comparison between humans and computers, and I think that's when we were talking about procreating the AI last episode or 2 episodes ago, whenever that was. That really sort of made me think, oh, are we going to go down that path as well? Are we going to talk about how computers are, in some form, at maybe some point, considered some kind of life? And what do we do with that? I don't know. So I was enjoying the episode quite a bit, regardless of maybe some misgivings about not being that into the murder mystery part as much as maybe I was to begin with. It was never the strongest part. I always cared more about what Darby cared about it, and the fact that she was driven to deal with it, and the backstory with Belle. That was always the more fascinating stuff. But obviously we have to do a lot of this murder mystery stuff now that we're deep into the show, and I don't know if like oh, Lee's got this alternate identity and she might actually be evil. Like, it wasn't that exciting to me. I was just kind of like, oh, okay, all right, well, we'll see where that goes. I'm not going to just assume that's the case, because it feels like they could turn this back again next episode where she's got a good reason for having this identity, and she's actually not a villain. She's not someone we should be scared of, or whatever. I don't know. But yeah, the episode ends. Darby gets a Morse code message after talking to Ray. The lamp starts flashing, and it tells her to meet someone at the pool at 10 o'clock because they know why Bill phoned David, which I've not mentioned yet, but that's one of the things they find out through the phone records, is that David, the suspicious guy, phoned Bill shortly before his death, and David refused to tell them why. But this feels like it could be a trap, of course, and Darby is freezing cold in this pool room, but notes that the water is actually still warm. The water's still being heated, so there's steam coming off the water. So she says, screw it, and takes off some of her clothes and jumps into the pool. But the big cliffhanger is that when she's in the pool, someone turns the pool cover on, which is like a glass sheet that comes off over the pool, and she tries to race to the edge to get up before it gets to the end, but she can't. So the cliffhanger is her trapped in the water underneath the glass, and presumably she will be saved at the start of next episode. It was an okay cliffhanger. It's one of those ones, though, where there's a great visual of her looking up at whoever the killer might be, but obviously it's all blurry and, like, concealed by the mist on the glass and the water and stuff. So you just get this, vague shape of a human being standing up top. That visual was great. The actual cliffhanger is a little bit toothless, just because, well, we know Darby's not going to die at the start of next episode. Okay, it's just not going to happen. I'd be fascinated to see what the show would be if that did happen, but we'll see. I did enjoy this more than last week's episode, I think. I will say the construction of the plot as a 7-episode thing is maybe showing a few of its kinks, just in the sense that once we get out of the great introductory period of the first couple episodes, I do think the actual investigation of the crimes and the murders in this episode and last episode have been probably the weakest parts of the show. So, and I was kind of like hoping that wouldn't feel that way, because when it was like, okay, Darby, the guy in charge, is giving you free rein to investigate now, he's supporting you now, I was kind of hoping that would instantly lead to some really compelling stuff where she's figuring things out and solving stuff. But honestly, it never feels like in this episode she does actually figure anything out or solve anything in the present day story. She just gets more questions, and it never feels like there's a good eureka moment or anything like that. But we'll see where it goes next time. Let me know what you thought of this one in the comments below. You can like, subscribe. These things help out a lot, help keep the lights on, and more people will find us. And of course, you can do even more by going over to patreon.com and supporting us over there, making sure all the content can keep coming. But that is me, so thank you once again for watching or listening. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?